So greetings, friends, and thank you for joining us during this webinar on racism and xenophobia in North America. This webinar is brought to you by the Commission of the Churches on International Affairs of the World Council of Churches. And it is the second regional webinar of a series of 8, which will be taking place until December 2019. Today's webinar has been prepared in collaboration with the WCC UN Liaison Office in New York City, represented by my colleague Donna Bollinger. And the webinar will be co-moderated by Professor Evelyn Parker, member of the CCIA, and also Professor of Practical Theology at Perkins School of Theology in the US, and co-moderated by Reverend Michael Blair, Executive Minister on Church and Mission at the United Church of Canada. So without any further ado, I now hand over to our co-moderators.
Welcome, everyone. We're glad that you are joining us for this very important conversation. Before we begin, I invite my colleague, Michael Blair, to say a word about the purpose of our webinar.
Particularly with the rise in white supremacy in the context of the celebration of the quadcentennial around slavery, we think it's important to begin to have a conversation across the border between the US and Canada on issues of race and racism and xenophobia, and the ways in which churches and church communities in the US and in Canada are attempting to address these issues. We recognize that not all the voices that experience racism or xenophobia are present in this conversation. And we are particularly interested in hearing from the National Council of Churches and the Canadian Council of Churches and that perspective in our meeting. So this is the start of a conversation. It's not the end of a conversation, and we hope in our collective consciousness will begin to make some links between the issues in the United States of America and in Canada. Evelyn.
Thank you, Michael. As we proceed, we ask everyone to mute their microphones if they're not talking, so that we can cancel out some of the background noise. So thank you very much for that. This is how we will proceed. We have several speakers from the USA context, speakers from the Canada context, and also a representative from the UN. First, the USA speakers will speak for about 5 to 7 minutes, and after those persons have spoken, they will have about 15 minutes for interaction or conversation together. I'll introduce every speaker individually, not as one group, so that those who are joining us or layering in later will hear who the speaker is at that moment. So let us begin. Our first speaker from the U.S. is the Reverend Andrea Alexander, and she is the Associate General Secretary for Action and Advocacy for Justice with the National Council of Churches USA. She leads the organization's priority to reverse the rising tide of mass incarceration in the United States and the NCC of Racial Equity Initiative. For over 20 years, she has worked with ecumenical interfaith, government, and grassroots her voice on a variety of justice issues. She received her BS in accounting and a JD also from the University of Missouri in Columbia, and her MDiv from the Princeton Theological Seminary in Princeton, New Jersey. Andrea, welcome you.
Thank you very much, and good morning or good afternoon, wherever in the world you may be. and welcome to everyone who has joined in on this conversation. As Reverend Blair mentioned earlier, this is a ripe and important time around the world, but particularly in the United States, to be addressing this issue of racism. The National Council of Churches since 1950 has served as a leading voice of witness to the living Christ. NCC unifies a diverse covenant community of 38 member communions and over 40 million individuals, 100,000 congregations from Protestant, Anglican, Orthodox, Evangelical, Historic, African American, and Living Peace traditions, in a common commitment to advocate and represent God's love and promise of unity in our public square. The NCC partners with secular interfaith partners and interfaith partners to advance a shared agenda of peace, progress, and positive change. And under that, those initiatives, one of the things that we have done together with these same partners is to address this issue of racism. As we all know, the church has been historically connected in many ways, both directly and implicitly in the issue of racism. I recently returned from a trip to Ghana in which we had an opportunity to visit the Cape Coast and Elmina slave castles, and right in the midst of those forts and dungeons and detention centers where people were kidnapped and specifically to be used for free labor, the church sat smack dab in the middle of them. And so it's a serious issue for us as a church. The church also has a historical context with the issue of both slavery and the doctrine of discovery. There was a Catholic priest, for instance, that suggested that using Africans for labor would be a good way to go, since labor in the North American and Caribbean areas at the time were having difficulty finding those who could actually withstand the heat in the southern regions of the country. History has been at its worst, the church has been silent and complicit, and even in its better states, we've distorted and looked at the issue of slavery and racism in rose-colored lenses. The church has taken a position to address this issue, and actually is I would say that the church is particularly right for addressing this issue, even though we are not always living out the best of who we are as a people. At the very core of who we are, at the very core of our beliefs, is that we are everyone created in the image of God, and that image is one in which everyone has the right to receive and to live out their lives and their greatest God-given potential, and that all humanity deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. National Council of Churches in 2018, in partnership with the World Council of Churches as part of its Justice and Peace Pilgrimage initiative, and with the United Nations Decade for People of African Descent, on the 50th anniversary of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King's assassination on April 4th, we launched our racial justice initiative under the Act Now campaign. Act Now being an acronym for Awaken, Confront, and Transform. And the awakening, our goal is to acknowledge and bring to light the scourge of racism, and again, the doctrine of discovery, guiding conversation, and bringing people together. You would think that it's interesting, we think about awakening to racism, awakening to these disparities, but it is interesting throughout this country, and particularly now, we see a lot of people who will use phrases like people using the race card if we acknowledge their racist issues, or deny that racism is real. Or we have had a senator, the highest ranking senator in our congressional structure, who said that basically we've addressed these issues when we elected President Obama as an African-American president in the United States. So in our awakening, what we have been doing is, one of the things that we're doing is collecting our member communion resources on racism. We have commissioned a historical review within our own archives on where there are implicit racist issues within policy structures and how we've lived out our communion life. And that's a project that's currently under construction. Also under the awakening, last year, after our big launch of the initiative at the rally, the National Council of Churches host our annual conference, which we call the Christian Unity Gathering. Last year, our focus was on what we called hard truths in a beloved community. And we took the time as a community to really bring to light, like we said, this hard truth. This year, our theme, I would say, is under the area of confronting, ending racism, confronting our past, revising our present, and naming God's preferred future. We will be meeting at Old Point Comfort, where the first 20 enslaved Africans from Angola were actually brought here on ship and sold for food. And then the last aspect of our act now stands for transformation. That transformation is something in which we have to address policies and practices. It is our hope that in this work, we will change hearts, minds, systems, and structures. And one of the things we've been doing in partnership also is with a coalition of civil and human rights organizations, faith communities, and others to begin to address the issues of reparations as well as policy changes. And my time is up right now. I look forward to continuing this conversation with our colleagues.
Thank you, Reverend Alexander. Let me now introduce the Reverend Dr. Angelique Walker-Smith. She is the National Senior Associate for Pan-African and Orthodox Church Engagement at the Bread for the World, based in Washington, D.C. She has been an ecumenical representative for the National Baptist Convention USA Incorporated and is an ecumenical representative to the Central Committee of the World Council of Churches, and works with the National Council of Churches in the USA as well. She is also president of the historic Black church family of Christian churches together, also made up of many of the USA national churches. She received her doctorate from the Princeton Theological Seminary. Welcome, Dr. Angelique Walker.
Thank you so much. Good morning or good afternoon to all. I am pleased to be following my dear colleague, Reverend Andrea Alexander. Some of the things she has said would also be appropriate for me to acknowledge as well. Just to start off in terms of my identity, the National Baptist Convention USA Incorporated, which is my national church from the cradle, is the oldest independent African-American Baptist body in the United States, founded in 1880. And it was founded through various threads throughout the United States that found their location in Montgomery, Alabama, in the throes of what you would know would be racial inequities and inequalities at that time. That church has continued to resist and to be an independent voice of people of African descent relative to the public space and the sacred space. In fact, we would see National Baptist in line with the other historic Black churches of offering a corrective to ecclesiology in the United States. That is not my focus now, but just to say that's the church from which I represent and come out of. Bread for the World is an organization that does public policy work on issues relative to hunger and poverty. Our vision is to actually end hunger and to subdue and to address issues relative to poverty. I bring the Pan-African lens and also work with the Orthodox families, but I also do many other things relative to the overall work of Bread for the World as a senior associate in their church relations department. Bread for the World has a priority around racial inequities. We have a racial assimilation in which people can engage the 10 policies that are identified in the devotional. Some of you will know that we're pleased both NCC and WCC have promoted, the devotional called Lament and Hope, on the occasion of the 400 years, the quadcentennial that Reverend Alexander has already mentioned. We are partners with NCC as well with our Circle of Protection and in other ways. National Baptist, of course, is a member of National Council, part of its founding after it was already founded the Fraternal Negro Council of Churches. We actually folded tents with other historic Black churches to be a part of the National Council of Churches. And those independent Black churches still maintain their prophetic and pastoral voices. Now, just a brief words about the period of enslavement and the principles that I hope we engage further. This comes out of a paper that I've written for Fordham Press, a paper I delivered in South Africa on a global conference on racism in the United States and South Africa. It was a comparative conference that was held last year in Soweto. Just a few points from that paper that is now sent on for publication. The basic contribution, the contribution that I'm speaking of has a basic premise. The premise is that there are at least 3 responses to the question of what the consequences of slavery have been. These responses include 1, robbery of identities of people of African descent, the legacy of resistance that has not accepted unjust practices, and policies that have mitigated against the interests and prosperity of people of African descent, and inequitable policies and practices targeted at people of African descent. So there are 3. The robbery of identities. A clear example of that would be my very name. People know me as Angelique Walker Smith. That really is not my name. Angelique came from a Frenchman that my father met when he was in the military. Walker is a name of the plantation owner. Smith is the name of the plantation owner of my husband, whose name I also took on. So people of African descent, many live today without the name that they would have had if it had not been for colonialism. That's one example of what we mean by robbery of identities. There are other examples, but that is one. Number 2, the narrative of resistance and inequitable policies. There's been a narrative of resistance since day one relative to people of African descent. Often the narrative, the popular narrative is we were submissive, we went along to get along. That is not true. As far back as Angola to the community of the Ngongo Nation, we know there was a battle. There was blood shed. There were people who refuted our people being taken from Angola to go anywhere other than the homelands from which they belong. So from day one, we know there was a kaleidoscope of faiths that informed their resistance. Across the Atlantic, we know there was this resistance. On the shoreline, we know there was resistance in Virginia as well. There were actually people of African descent who took Virginia to court. And there were times when people of African descent actually won, or there were other forms of resistance that actually found alliances, sometimes with church partners. Limited, but it did exist. Then finally, the piece that I would want to highlight around the area of resistance, there were also slave rebellions. We think about Nat Turner's revolt. We think about Charleston and what happened down in Charleston. There are a number of incidences that we point that were not only legal at the beginning, but throughout the history, also where people rose up out of their sense of faith who resisted what was put upon them. Of course, we all know about the Civil Rights Movement. We know about the early 1900s. I won't repeat that history because many of us know that. But it is important to identify the seasons of resistance of people of African descent. Oftentimes with some limited parts of coalition, but many times not. So people of African descent have had their own sense of agency. I also want to mention 10 policies. I won't be able to go into them in great depth, but there were 10 major policies that are outlined in the devotional Lament and Hope, and also in our simulation in which people can play back the economics around these issues as well as the devotional issues. And these 10 policies particularly had a traumatic effect on why it is people of African descent still have a huge chasm of wealth disparities, income disparities, and also we know about the punitive measures of the correctional system. Those are just 3 glaring examples of the inequities that we speak of. So the first one I would like to speak of the policy, just very quickly, is the Andrew Johnson land policy. Number 2, the land seizures from 1865 to the present day. Number 3, the National Housing Act of 1934, Part 1, and the National Housing Act of 1934, Part 2. Number 4, number 5, the Social Security Act and the way it was implemented unfairly. Then policy number 6, the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938. Number 7, the inequitable distribution of the GI Bill of 1944, and primarily that was not delivered equitably because of the state laws. And in many cases, it was the states that pushed back on federal law, and that is still the case as we think about the issues of race today. Number 8, the impact of separate but equal. Number 9, subprime loans from 1970s to the present day. And number 10, which we have talked about on many occasions, and that is the war on drugs that has led us to mass incarceration, as well as the painful history of enslavement. These are points that are outlined in the devotional. It's a free guide. You can get it online. Just type Lament and Hope, the Pan-African Devotional, to come up for free. And we also have publications that have been widely distributed globally and are being used as a resource. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Walker-Smith. And our third and final excuse me, speaker from the U.S. is the Reverend Seth Wispaway. And let me just give you a brief introduction of him. He is a new intern pastor at Rincon Congregational United Church of Christ in Tucson, Arizona. Seth is a pastor, organizer, educator, and nonprofit consultant. He was raised in Charlottesville, Virginia, where he and his family also lived for the past 6 years. Most recently, Seth spent the past 3 years mobilizing and pastoring people of faith and conscience in the work of confronting and dismantling white supremacy through direct public witness, advocacy, and education. With a fellow pastor, he co-created the entity Congregate in Charlottesville in 2017, a multi-faith effort to equip people to speak up and show up in confronting and dismantling white supremacy. Reverend?
Good morning to you all from Tucson, Arizona. It's early here, and I'm grateful to be with you all. My name is Seth Wispaway. I use he and him pronouns, and I am coming from Tucson on occupied land that's been stewarded for generations by the Tohono O'odham Nation. I've been asked to say a few words about whiteness and white supremacy in the U.S. context, and I think to do that well, with the privilege of following the previous two speakers, I should identify myself as a cis-hetero white identifying male, but who really is European American. My ancestry is Dutch, to be more specific about it, and it's important to name that for reasons that I hope become clear. As has already been mentioned, white supremacy and whiteness as an ideology has been baked in to the national DNA of the United States of America since its inception as a nation state. And white supremacy intersects with what I'll say are three other dominant spiritualities that comprise our national religion: patriarchy, militarism, and consumer capitalism. These all infuse our national DNA. White supremacy privileges the power and so-called rectitude of white men, especially. So the ideals that we give lip service to as a country, that all have certain inalienable rights, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness for all, are actually subsumed so that resources can ultimately be pooled for a few, and mainly those few look like me. By default, this is not just about individual privilege. When I'm pulled over by a cop, though that too, it's also about everything Reverend Dr. Angelique said, related to the loans I can secure, the legacy of landed wealth that I can possess, and more, and so on and so forth. I would recommend for all of our participants today, National Book Award winner from 2016 by Dr. Ibram X. Kendi called Stamped from the Beginning, that really weaves together just how baked in this dominant spirituality of white supremacy is, that informs everything about our daily interactions. It really does. To go into my local context, and probably most of the reason I was invited to join everyone today, in Charlottesville, as most everyone probably knows, in 2017 we experienced the largest gathering of explicit white supremacists in modern history, when we became a focal point for an ostensible protest around the vote to remove one of our Jim Crow era white supremacist Civil War participation trophies in our public park. And the excuse of that removal was given to rally hundreds of mainly white men emboldened by the election of our current neo-fascist in chief, to reassert those same land claims, the chants that a lot of people remember: xenophobic, racist, anti-Semitic, you will not replace us, Jews will not replace us, blood and soil, disturbed many, and it did create a national trauma. But one thing I want to put forth for our conversation and thinking today is how, as quote-unquote evil as a lot of that inbreaking of violent white supremacy was over the whole summer we experienced in Charlottesville, it wasn't just about August 11th and 12th. As evil as we might want to call that, in a sense, I would say those hundreds of white men were being more honest than many of us. When they say you will not replace us, these are men like me who grew up in the United States of America being told their whole lives implicitly, if not explicitly, don't even worry about why you're here. You don't need to do that soul work, that integration work. Don't worry how you're going to rise to the top. We've made this for you. And so for men, white men, growing up in a world that's daring to assert that Black Lives Matter, or women's bodies belong to themselves, or women should be paid more, or Muslims are people too, you will not replace us, is a clarion call that has zero light between itself and the current White House. And that White House itself is symptomatic of this history we're talking about, not an aberration. And so it's a clarion call then too to people of faith and conscience, especially white people of faith and conscience, to locate ourselves and root around and find some stakes, which is hard for the American church when you consider that we have this dominant narrative that we're a Christian nation, going back to things like the doctrine of discovery. And so there aren't many baked in stakes. You actually derive social equity if you call yourself a Christian and you're white in the United States. That gets you further than if you don't. And in Charlottesville, we saw this, unfortunately, by many white faith leaders, that when the stakes couldn't have been higher, most pastors, especially white male pastors, who would quote Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. 51 other weeks out of the year, when push came to shove, sounded verbatim like the 8 Alabama clergymen that King was responding to in a Birmingham jail. They defaulted to recognizing that their Christian identity was more or less co-equal with their white male American identity. And what we encourage, a lot of what our faith response in Charlottesville and a lot of the behind the scenes work was seen as quote unquote prophetic, but really our posture was designed to be pastoral, that we wanted a perspective shift, that people are angry and scared and hurt and confused. This is what we're called to respond to as pastoral people. To treat the needs of the people as holy is pastoral work. You don't just need a clergy collar for that. But if you shift your perspective to those whom white supremacy seeks to demonize and oppress and crush down, then you realize that showing up to confront and dismantle it, whether it's on the front lines with actual neo-Nazis or diving into systemic racism in housing and hunger policy and social service policy and more, you recognize that that gospel-specific work is deeply pastoral. It just might appear prophetic because not enough white Christians are doing it. And so that's why I think, though, and this is the question I'll leave us with in my opening remarks, when you look at those front lines, though, from Charlottesville, it's the beautiful fabric of shalom. It's queer rabbinical students and Muslim women and black civil rights leaders and stay-at-home parents and lesbian clergy and very few white men confronting those white men. And so I think we need to think about this as the ideology of whiteness infusing so much of the church here. It's a specific ideology that ironically thrives by trying to make itself non-specific and all-encompassing. And our white comfort continues to get a lot of equity by the self-serving grace that we give ourselves for being well-meaning in these contexts we're talking about. And it'll be uncomfortable to dismantle that, but it's such a liberating cost to shoulder if we really want the beloved community.
We have now about 15 minutes, no more than 15 minutes for the USA group to interact with each other. We don't have to take all of that time. We can move to the Canada group, but I want to give us time to do that.
I just wanted to acknowledge that Dr. Ibram X. Kendi actually will be one of our speakers at our Christian Unity Gathering. And we're actually will be giving away, as part of the registration packet, his newest book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. So these kinds of writings are everywhere right now, and I think that's really key and important as well, in ways that people can come to grips and understanding. But of course, one has to be willing to actually seek this kind of information and to hear. And so STEM from the beginning, and again, the How to Be an Anti-Racist are two very good resources that I would like to just encourage our listeners to consider reading.
Thank you, Reverend Alexander. Any other comments?
So if I may ask a question for you to think about. So Seth mentioned this notion of the ideology of whiteness, and both Angelique and Andrea has talked about the need to look at policies and how those policies impact or are racist in themselves. So I wonder if both of you may want to say something about what kind of process you use to kind of look at those policies to unearth the ideology of whiteness.
I would say that, I mean, for us, when you say unearthing whiteness, I'll give you an example about a policy issue and how we approach addressing policies with the National Council of Churches, for instance. At the end of last year, there was a big push to pass, and it did pass, the First Step Act as a criminal justice bill. National Council of Churches was in a very small minority that opposed that bill. And we opposed that bill in partnership with family and organizations that have firmly incarcerated persons at the hub of their leadership. We oppose the bill because every policy we look at, if our primary focus is on dismantling racism and addressing mass incarceration, which is one of our priorities, any bill, any policy that does not address those two issues intentionally and at their core, we can't support. And in this particular case, there were some good parts of the bill, but it was going to perpetuate what we say disparate impact for people of color. And my argument is that it's not a disparate impact, it's intentional. So as Dr. Walker Smith talked about the war on drugs, it was not just a war on drugs, but the whole historical context, even before that war, what led to that war on drugs. We now have history that says Richard Nixon's administration knew that there was not a major drug problem, but they focused on it because, as his one of the members of his administration, Ehrlichman, says, we could arrest Black people, and then we can, target the white hippies. And then we also have a historical context in which Lee Atwater, under, I think it was Reagan's administration, basically gave the whole playbook for how to address policies and use what was coded terms like urban and disparate impact, I think was even one of his terms. So these things are baked within our policies. And so when you're dealing with policy issues, you can't just try to address that issue in a vacuum without, or I should say, address it in isolation without taking into context its historical construct, which has races, classes, and gender, and all other types of xenophobic premises underneath.
I would agree with Reverend Alexander. She's really given a wonderful analysis of how we approach policy in general. That's certainly the case at Bread for the World. Any policy that Bread for the World takes on must be evaluated from a racial equity lens. So if it's global food security, if it's global nutrition, if it's immigration, if it's mass incarceration, any of those issues have to have an evaluation of racial equity lens. So we're committed to that at Bread for the World. So what that means is looking at the policy and saying, if we didn't have the policy, what has been the impact of people who have been affected by racism? The second one is, well, if we adopt the policy, then how do we make sure that's included in the thinking relative to the policy in question? Moreover, we are informed by our membership. So we are in partnership with National Council of Churches. We are engaged with churches nationally, wherever they may be, and globally, who give us input into how it is we articulate the policy within our communications on advocacy with the member churches as well. So that's baked in for us in terms of being a priority. And National Baptist Convention, by virtue of our very genesis of who we are, we're always looking at at things from a racial equitable lens because we're born out of the struggle. That is our identity. That is the only way we really know to be, have been since the enslavement period. So that is baked into our ecclesiology, is baked into whatever we do in terms of public theology and our very identity, because the people primarily related to that church are people of African descent with global connections with the Pan-African agenda.
And I would add one more thing, and that being, and maybe it's saying the same thing, but kind of a summary, is it is with that lens of a racial equity lens that also matters as to what you decide is a reasonable compromise. Often compromise when it comes to legislation in particular is on the backs of those who are already marginalized. So when you're compromising on anything. I mean, this thing, going back to the mass incarceration bill, if I look at immigration, there will be those who say, give people a right to stay here, but let's create like a second-class citizenship in which those who come will not be able to access full rights and privileges of all other citizens. I think that's a compromise too far. Again, because if you look at that from a racial equity lens, we should never be willing to accept any group of people that will not be able to access full access. In the United States, citizenship is equal to full humanity.
May I add one other comment to the conversation? I know it's a different comment, but I would like to add that it's important for us to realize that during the enslavement period, Mexico and Canada and some of our indigenous communities embraced those who were still enslaved or had some kind of fraternal receptivity. I think that's an important piece to acknowledge around this North American context, that Canada has been there, and then also Mexico, and then indigenous communities. I'm not saying all people in all those contexts welcome those who were enslaved, but there is a clear track record of those who did. And I think this is an appropriate time to acknowledge that.
Thank you. Are there any other comments around the from the three presenters?
Actually, in the chat group, we have a comment from our friend from Cameroon, all the way from Africa. It's a question to Angélique. He would says, I would like her to make clear to us how naming can be racist or can portray and promote racism. More clarification, please.
Yes, I appreciate that. I mean, it's a glaring point of how racism has worked when we realize that many people of African descent in the U.S. have names carried on by their plantation owners. I mean, this is absolutely appalling. But that's part of how it is identities were robbed. That we are very challenged to find out, even now we have DNA, but that's not even complete because the databases are very incomplete, quite frankly. But to find out who your ancestors were. We are stymied by the lack of information and what was done to us through all these different policies and other atrocities to know exactly what our lineage is and what it could be. That said, we have adopted new identities. We have survived and we have thrived. So although my name is Angélique Walker Smith, and I know that is not my given name from my ancestors, we still proceed in our future because we understand that our future is at stake and we're people of faith. But from the very name to the very lineage, to identify our lineage, that is a stymied exercise in terms of knowing who we are.
Thank you, Reverend Walker Smith. I would like to add that the insidiousness of white supremacy is that in all the places where we would educate, the educational system for specifically is designed to maintain this this lack of identity, even for people who are of European descent, because ordinarily there's not the common person does not identify their ethnicity. So we are, in a sense, in this ideology, continuously reinforcing that you are American, that your names are hierarchical, and that even among people of African descent, sometimes are not aware of the lineage that goes back to Africa and have resisted even embracing that. Are there any other comments from the three presenters?
In the chat room.
I'm sorry, I would just add one last piece, and that is to say that our schools do not teach the history that many of us have come to know through other supplementary means. Our identities around any of the number of things that certainly Dr. Parker has identified and I've said earlier. But the education system, the public education system, there are even states now that are trying to erase the period of the enslavement period, for example. So we have serious problems of what it means to, quote, educate and to have diversities of narratives included in those stories.
Yes, we've actually had, I think that's a really good point. We have stories constantly coming out. We had a class, actually we've had several situations where you've had teachers having kids reenact slavery to try to teach about slavery, which is horrible. Or they've actually, in doing work, asked them to identify the positive aspects of slavery. What were the benefits of slavery? So education is a major issue, and which goes to all the work I would say that all of us are doing as part of, in our acronym, of course, that's part of the awakening, confronting, and transforming. So it's named different things, but that's part of what we're all trying to do is educating large adults and not even just the children, getting the adults to understand and acknowledge these issues so that our children are not continually being indoctrinated to the original sin of this country being a racism and looking at people and not seeing them as fully human.
Yes. We have about 1 more minute. I would like to ask if we could move ahead to the Canadian presenters, and then perhaps we'll have time to collect all the comments that are coming up on the feed. Is that okay?
Yes.
Michael?
On the Canadian side, we will hear 3 presentations. One from the Canadian Council of Churches and Jonathan Schmidt, who is the works for the Canadian Council of Churches and is responsible for some of its justice work, and in particularly runs a program called Deepening Understanding of Intercultural Ministries. And after Jonathan, we'll hear from Archbishop Mark McDonald, who is the Indigenous bishop, the National Indigenous Bishop for the Anglican Church of Canada. And then following a presentation from Carmen Ramirez, we will bring a perspective from an immigrant perspective to this conversation. So Jonathan, over to you.
Right. Yeah, so I was asked to share about the work of the Canadian churches, what they're doing to address racism. And anytime I think that question is asked, we need to name what is happening in the context of the Canadian churches. It's in a context where we're well on the way in the shift and change in which we have shrinking national resources, shrinking national churches, shrinking capacity and resources at those levels. And much of what is happening in this work can't be simply named as being what the churches are doing, but the need to support and resource local grassroots initiatives where more of the energy and capacity are shifting. I also want to name that in talking about racism for the Canadian Church, one of the largest challenges is the Canadian cultural myth that we are peaceful, inclusive, diverse, and welcoming as a culture and a society. And the churches are well embedded and rehearsed in sharing that myth as well. One of the US speakers just did it for us. When we tell our historical narrative around anti-Black racism, the main narrative is the Underground Railroad and our welcoming of freed slaves. The narrative in Canada rarely talks about actually the larger picture of the fact that we were slaveholders and of the treatment of those freed slaves and their descendants since. So racism is strongly not just out there in our society, but because the church shares that myth of being peaceful, inclusive, diverse, and welcoming, it's well expressed within its structures and within its members. I also want to observe that within the Canadian Church, we've had waves of attention to racial justice, and we're currently in a wave of attention to racial justice, where there's a great deal of attention to racism, oppression, xenophobia, Islamophobia, and a number of programs and workshops emerging. The challenge to the Canadian Church is how to make this attention to racial justice long-term and sustainable, and not only about offering and creating one-off workshops and programs, which we're comfortable with, but creating a culture of radical, just inclusion as our ethos and our identity as churches. So I want to go through very quickly, first of all, some of the lenses that are used in racial justice work in Canada, and then look specifically at some of the work that's happening ecumenically through the Canadian Council of Churches and other agencies, and then very briefly also a summary of what denominations are doing. It's clear that there is racism, and expressed in many different ways in Canada. And the primary lens that has been used in recent years is that of reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, which comes out of our role in not only the Indian residential schools, but also in other ways in which racism has been and continues to be experienced by Indigenous communities. That's been the primary lens in recent years, but it also has helped call us to name and recognize other expressions of racism and xenophobia. Another lens that coming out of that has been key in our work has been around decolonization and around the impacts, historically but also today, of the doctrine of discovery. When we look specifically at anti-racism, there is a great deal of focus on the lens of anti-Black racism, but also colorism and racism as it's experienced by other communities. Xenophobia continues to be a strong lens right now. Migration is an issue in our upcoming federal election. Islamophobia is another lens, and white privilege is another lens as well. The other way of engaging racism is around intersectionality. Michael mentioned that part of my work is around intercultural ministry and resourcing intercultural ministry, and the need to address racism within wider contexts of power and privilege within our culture, society, and churches. What's happening in the Canadian Council of Churches and ecumenically? The Canadian Council of Churches in 2001 established the Canadian Ecumenical Anti-Racism Network, which was born out of the United Nations World Conference Against Racism held in Durban, South Africa. Its mandate is to educate church members and to be educated on crimes of racism and racial discrimination and the role of the churches. It has a steering committee, and one of the primary roles of that steering committee is it's people who have historically done work around anti-racism in the churches. Its primary function has been a support network for each other. But that group has also created resources and workshops for the wider church, and is been involved in networking and supporting those, and naming again that shift to the grassroots, those across Canada, particularly at the local level, who are engaging racial justice. Another part of the Canadian Council of Churches work is the Forum for Intercultural Leadership and Learning, which resources intercultural ministry and in context across Canada. It has a vision of radical, just intercultural communities, shalom, a beloved community, and naming and resourcing how that can be lived out in the church. It recognizes an intersectionality of power and privilege in relationships and ministry across difference, but racial justice is the primary focus in that. The Canadian Council of Churches also engages federally Currently, some of our primary work is around immigration policy. We're participating in a court challenge of the Safe Third Country Agreement with the United States. We've been at the table in the development of Canada's national anti-racism policy, as well as national poverty reduction strategy, of which race and calling for racism to be one of the lenses there. Other ecumenical agencies in Canada, such as Kairos, the Canadian Ecumenical Justice Initiatives, and Citizens for Public Justice, also have strong lenses of racial justice. Kairos has been a leader in some of the reconciliation work, working around raising awareness around missing and murdered Indigenous women. It has an exercise called the Blanket Exercise that helps Canadians name that history they don't always recognize. They also have strong anti-racism lenses in their advocacy for policymaking, domestic and intercultural, and in other work such as climate change, poverty, and migration. And then finally, very quickly, a survey of the Canadian denominations. They also a strong primary lens of reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. Quite a bit of work in anti-racism, anti-oppression, diversity training for their leaders, a recognition of systemic racism of the institutions that marginalize, so that they look at their own systemic racism, addressing it using codes of conduct, and training for their leadership. In terms of Islamophobia and xenophobia, the local context has largely led the way through knowing and standing with their neighbors in communities. Finally, one denomination, when I did this survey, said every 17 seconds, 365 days a year, someone in Canada is assisted in a non-discriminatory basis, regardless of race, creed, gender, age, sexual orientation, etc. So recognizing that there are encounters across race every moment in the churches. So finally, just to close, the challenge for the church is a need for long-term sustainable, not just one-off workshops and programs on racism and xenophobia. We need to come to terms with the myths that we share with our culture of being peaceful, inclusive, diverse, and welcoming. And then finally, the need to create a culture and ethos, locally and nationally, of radically just, inclusive communities and organizations.
Thanks, Jonathan. Our next presenter is Archbishop Mark MacDonald. Mark serves as the National Indigenous Bishop for the Anglican Church of Canada, and also is the North American President for the WCC. Archbishop Mark.
Thank you very much, Michael. I'm very grateful to be a part of this discussion. Canada, along with the rest of North America, is in the midst of a massive and urgent struggle for truth, justice, and reconciliation. There are many aspects of that, and we have heard a lot about that in what's been said before, which I want to say how grateful I am to hear. I want to draw out four aspects of the truth, justice, and reconciliation struggle that has to do with Indigenous people. The first thing that I want to mention is that back in the 80s and 90s, a large group of people who had been victims of the residential school system came out and exposed the treatment that they had. And this leads me to my first issue and point, and that is that there has been forces unleashed by these survivors of the residential schools that are challenging and beginning to have an impact on Canadian life and society. So these forces that have been unleashed are challenging the mindset and the assumptions of colonialism and racism, and they have a number of different aspects. So I think that that's important. The second thing that I want to say derives from the first, and that is that what is being revealed is a systemic pattern of racism and colonialism within the life of Canadian society, so that racism and colonialism are ideas and structures of thought and feeling that have impacted Canada's law, governance, its culture, its language, its entertainment. Every aspect of Canadian life has been infected by these ideas associated with racism and colonialism. And so we are part of the struggle that we're involved in is dealing with that systemic aspect of Canadian racism. The third thing that I want to bring out, which has been referenced before, specifically by Jonathan, thank you, and that is that the churches also have been not only victims of this kind of colonialism, racism, they have also been perpetrators of systemic evil in a number of different ways. The churches played an animating role in the ideology and execution of colonialism within North America, and specifically and importantly in Canada. And so the church has a lot of work to do to decolonize its mind, its law, its theology, and all of these things. All of them have been infected. But I think that one aspect of this, which is important to underline, is that in most of the mainline churches, perhaps even all of them, there are expressions of self-determination on the part of Indigenous peoples within those bodies. My position was created by Indigenous people as a motion and movement towards self-determination within the Anglican Church of Canada. And so there is a strong effort to positively step forward away from racism and colonialism and the systemic effects of it by establishing self-determining entities within the larger church body. The fourth and final thing that I wish to mention is the intersection between racism, colonialism, and the destruction of the environment. This is a huge issue for Indigenous peoples. Indigenous peoples, as you are probably aware, in the Canadian Arctic and Alaska and Greenland, Norway and other Russia and other countries in the Arctic. These people have been, are most severely and urgently affected by climate disruption. And so they are the front line and are experiencing huge challenges to food safety, to the capacity to have a human and successful corporate life in the midst of such huge and massive change. But there are other things. You're probably aware of the pipeline issues, which have been protested, and there have been attempts to stop pipelines on the part of Indigenous peoples. These represent again, Indigenous people and the truth, justice, and reconciliation of this movement that I'm speaking about. This is a particular environmental focus of that movement, and one that has huge consequences, not just to Indigenous peoples, but to everybody on the planet. So those four things, briefly recounting them, I wanted to, number one, talk about the forces that have been unleashed by the reclaiming of humanity by Indigenous survivors of oppression. I wanted to mention that this has led to an unveiling of systemic racism and colonialism in all of the institutions and aspects of Canadian life and culture. And number three, I wanted to say that this has a particular relevance to the church, manifested in things like self-determination. And finally, number four, that this has a huge intersection with our concerns for the environment and climate change. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bishop Mark. And our final presenter is Carmen Ramirez. Carmen is a doctoral student who works with the Deepening Understanding of Intercultural Ministries that is run through the Canadian Council of Churches, and also does some consulting work on issues of race and inclusion. And Carmen will offer us a bit of a perspective from an immigrant. So Carmen.
Thank you. Welcome everyone. Here's my topic, Behind the Friendly Image of Canada, a Brief Look. It was October of 1976 when my sister, 12, my brother, 11, and I, 5, embarked on a plane from Lima to Toronto. My sister was so mature and tall for her age, though that wouldn't be the case today. She had naturally replaced my mother upon her departure 3 years prior. I believe we were one of the, quote, lucky migrants who were able to travel by plane, as many who crossed the land, quote, mugged, raped, and dismembered, or have died trying to reach their destination. The only danger we encountered was that the plane diverted to Montreal due to severe weather conditions in Toronto. The threat was a snowstorm. My sister was so awesome. She even managed to take us sightseeing as we waited to re-embark the plane that took us to Toronto, where my mother anxiously waited for us. She had worked many long hours and many different low-paying jobs and had even lived in fear of being deported. She continued to live that fear for many years after our arrival. This was one of the many migrant stories. It is not the first, nor is it the last. My mother's vague knowledge of Canada was that it was a friendly place, that it tolerated minorities. Therefore, she looked forward to having a happily ever after type experience for herself and her children. Little did she know that in Canada, there was a, quote, an official apartheid of culture and identity. It organizes the social space of Canada, first between whites and non-whites, and then within the non-whites themselves, end quote. Racism, a system of oppression fed by individual and collective attitudes and by actions that discriminate against, oppress, exclude, and limit minoritized people on the basis of race and or color of their skin. Racism is an unforeseen reality in Canada for many, if not all, immigrants that dream of being in a better place. There are some other well-known stories that have forever marked Canada as an unfriendly place. In 1628, the first slave was recorded in Canada. Although by 1688, slavery had been prohibited in France, it was permitted in the colonies because it provided a massive labor force needed to clear the land, to construct buildings, and to work the sugar plantations. In 1885, a $50 head tax was imposed on every Chinese person. By 1900, it was increased to $100. By 1903, it was $500. Eventually, they were denied entry from 1923 to 1947. From 1911 to 1939, Jewish peoples were not allowed to be employed by government agencies. They were also barred from elite social clubs, beaches, and holiday resorts in Toronto, Montreal, and Winnipeg. Canada was the only Western country that did not allow Jewish refugees. In 1942, the Canadian-Japanese internment occurred, where 22,000 Canadian Japanese were evacuated from British Columbia due to national security after the attack on Pearl Harbor. More recently, an article by the Toronto Star in 2002 brought to light the police practice called racial profiling. Most affected by this practice are Black males who are consistently stopped by police for no reason except the color of their skin. Islamophobia is on the rise since September 11, 2001, due to the increased national security measures called the War on Terrorism. Perhaps one of the most consistently discriminated peoples since Canada's existence are the First Nations peoples of Canada. Since the beginning, Indian Acts have been edited in order to civilize and Christianize First Nations peoples. They have had to endure their children being taken to residential schools until the 1990s, and more recently, their children are taken legally by Children's Aid. First Nations peoples continue to be overrepresented in Canadian correctional facilities. Also, schools on the reserves are underfunded by $2,000 to $3,000 per child per year. The federal government provides $0 for libraries, $0 for computers and software, teacher training, $0 for extracurricular activities, and $0 for many other school activities. There are also the disturbing amount of unsolved cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women across Canada. So how has Canada dealt with this tainted and not so friendly image? One of the ways is that in 1988, the Canadian Multiculturalism Act was passed in order to preserve and enhance multiculturalism in Canada. Unfortunately, many people, including Banerjee, has noticed that, quote, multiculturalism cannot solve inequality or even racism, end quote. I must admit that I do not claim to have a solution to offer in these 5 to 7 minutes, but my time was simply to spend in bringing to light the real Canadian experience for immigrants behind the friendly image of Canada. Thank you.
Thanks, Carmen. So we have about 15 minutes now for some conversations. Remember, you can type questions into the chat box, and opportunities for dialogue between the 3 Canadian presenters and any others who have questions that they would want to raise.
There's a question here that I see on the chat. It says, how is racism being experienced in North America from recent immigrant communities, both perpetrators and victims of racism? I'd like to say, which I didn't get to talk about in my time, is that there's also within the immigrant communities, like for example, the Latino community, which I belong to, there's also racism within amongst ourselves that is also based on color. The lighter you are, the better it is. The less Black you have in you, the better it is. And that's a part of, I guess you could say, colorism. And that has been a reality for me, being of mixed race. And that's one of the things that occurs in addition to the racism that we experience across Canada.
I would note how quickly migrants to Canada are enculturated into that narrative of Canada as peaceful, images and ideas about Canada's First Nations peoples. Then I've also heard of racism between migrant groups. Some of the strongest anti-immigrant voices here in Toronto are from some of the recent immigrant groups who don't want other migrant groups to come into Canada. But I would name in all of that when we look at racism, we have to look at power and privilege. And so those kinds of conversations need to be nuanced to it. So it's fascinating that sort of the hierarchies that very quickly become part of the experience of Canadian immigrants.
Other questions or comments?
So I would ask both Mark and Carmen. So one of the pieces that we haven't talked a lot about, both in the U.S. and Canada, and Mark talked about it to some extent, is how racism has shaped the structures and ways of being of our churches. And Mark talked about the Indigenous self-determining church, but I'm wondering if either of you have ideas on what is working, what is needed in terms of the churches, denominations, ecumenical agencies confronting their own structures as racist, or if you have other experiences of that.
Well, I can respond to that. I think that it's very important to understand that the churches had built into the structure the elimination of Indigenous people as a cultural entity within the Canadian society and within their own structures. So, for instance, when our prayer books were translated from English into Indigenous languages, they often did not include an ordination service. The idea was that if an Indigenous person was to be ordained, they would be so assimilated into white society that they would not need service in their own language. This is just a small example, but the general attitude towards Indigenous people within their structure was to eliminate Indigenous people. So, for instance, in major cities, when an ethnic group moves in, it's very common for churches to church denominational structures to create systems that welcome them and allow them to express their cultural and linguistic identity within the life of the whole. That was not given to Indigenous people until very, very recently. So you see, the goal of this was to eliminate Indigenous people as a cultural identity by having them integrate and assimilate into the larger church bodies. The pressure for that is built in so that it's still operating today. So when we say, for instance, that we want to be an Indigenous expression of our church denomination, people say, well, you're leaving the church. And they cannot apprehend the idea of an Indigenous expression of Christian faith, because they are not only so habituated to their own experience and ideas, they are hostile towards the idea that Indigenous people would create a different form of it based on their culture, assumptions, values, and ideals. So those are just a few thoughts that I have in response to your question. This is an ongoing struggle that we are right in the midst of, and it has to do with the way that people think and understand life.
It's probably also important to note that the same kind of framework were used for peoples of African descent who spoke English. That there was an assumption that even though in the early days folks were pushed out of the white church, there is a sense in which they were expected to still come back in and not have a separate identity. So some of that colonial, I think, perspective is operative mostly in our mainline denominations.
Yeah.
Any other questions or comments? Otherwise, we will move to our final presenter. Okay, Evelyn.
Our day, she's a member of the UN Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent. She is a human rights attorney and an executive director of the Daylight Rule of Law, Access to Justice, Advocacy, and Internationally. Her litigation, public policy, research, teaching, and capacity building work over the past 2 decades has focused heavily on racial justice, non-discrimination, and human rights advocacy. She has extensive experience in criminal and civil litigation on behalf of individuals and communities within the Black diaspora. She holds a bachelor's degree from the Harvard University, and her JD is from Stanford Law School. Welcome.
Hi there, thank you. Thank you. I want to thank everybody for this rich and robust conversation and for the invitation to be a part of it. This has been a really great period for me to sit and listen. And I have a lot of respect for the World Council of Churches as well. Can everybody hear me? I'm okay? Okay. Having had the opportunity to sort of anchor this, maybe I'll start by saying, I think we're in a very interesting moment in history. And I think the question for us as racial justice advocates, as Black folk looking to expand our civil rights and our commitments to liberation, I think a question for us is, are we ready? And I'm biting that a little bit off of the Tiffany Hardish comedy special that someone sat me down to watch over the weekend, which she entitles They Ready. And it's basically, she sort of made it, she reached back and grabbed all of these amazing, diverse, intersectional comedians, trans folk, women, men, right, the whole deal, and really presented the mainstream with a diverse understanding of what it means to excel in this context. And it made me have this question, do we also have that responsibility? Are we also living up to that? We're in a moment politically where racism has become very obvious and undeniable in some of our countries, certainly in the US. And we're at a moment where there does also seem to be an appetite for both resistance and liberation and the discourse of liberation in ways there weren't before. And the same thing is true in terms of, you can look at any issue, migration. Everywhere you look, you're seeing aspects of both abject inhumanity and people's real outrage at that, and the space that maybe this is a moment where we can pivot and make some change. And are we really ready for that? We have this understanding at this point that the social conditioning of white supremacy has been both profound and very effective, right? Our education, our media have really fed a lot of people a narrative that has been incredibly persuasive in the election booths, in perpetuating all sorts of institutional racism. And we're seeing that as more and more apparent, these profound commitments that people have to white supremacy. And, we have a discourse that's evolving to really address that, right? So we're talking a lot about reparations these days. It's a hot topic. It's a topic that's openly discussed in the American political sphere. It's openly discussed internationally, and that's new, right? So we should acknowledge that this is a moment where conversations are happening that weren't happening before. But why I say, are we ready, is we're seeing there's a real challenge for people who feel strongly about civil rights, who feel strongly about liberation. There's a real challenge to robustly engage in these areas, right? So when we talk about reparations, for example, on one hand, a whole bunch of people are talking about, well, I didn't do anything, it wasn't my problem, this was years ago, it's history. And a whole bunch of other people are talking about getting a check. But obviously the reparations debate and discourse is much more, has much more depth and has much more nuance than any of those sort of polarized views. There are reparations frameworks. CARICOM has a 10-point framework that our working group has adopted. And there is an idea that reparations isn't necessarily about assigning a dollar value to the exploitation of certain bodies in the past, but really unpacking the ways in which institutional racism persists and is perpetuated in our everyday life, right? And I really appreciated some of the comments I heard earlier today around take a look at the criminal justice system, take a look at the child welfare system, right? When you walk into family courts in the US, there's one or two demographics that really stand out to you. And when you hear about why children are being removed from their parents, very, very often you can make a cultural link more quickly than you can make an abuse or a neglect link, right? So ultimately, we see that our very institutions, and particularly our justice institutions, have evolved in a certain way. Reparations isn't necessarily about giving me, or exclusively about giving me a certain amount of money because my ancestors were enslaved by white colonists, right? Reparations is also about understanding that as I walk through my life, I encounter a series of assumptions, expectations, and stereotypes that limit my freedom, that limit my opportunity, that limit my access. And what is the role that we can play in really dismantling that? And this is why I really appreciate working with the World Council of Churches, because I think you both play probably the pivotal role in this, and you have a lot of opportunity. And I think a challenge that we have in American society for sure, but I would submit throughout North America and possibly globally as well, is the need to actually supplement whatever is happening in the media, whatever is happening in our educational systems. All the social conditioning that folk are getting need to be supplemented with a deep and critical understanding of what is it to be a Black person in the world today? What is it to be a person of African descent in the world today? What does institutional racism look like in sector by sector by sector? What do reparations look like? How are the ways in which, for example, white slaveholders were given reparations at the end of slavery, how does that actually translate to magnanimous and tremendous wealth today? And what's the flip side of that, right? So I think for us, as a community, we have an obligation to both educate and to really start having these conversations actively and specifically, not just to talk about there is institutional racism everywhere, but to really tease out these understandings for the people whom we influence and to really offer them critical analyses that they can then bring into conversations, bring into their own spaces around what it means to be committed to both justice and liberation. I say this as a Black American who understands that our own initial, our civil rights struggle in the 60s was heavily informed by the educational role of the church. And I think there's that role again that needs to be uplifted, in part because our educational system is both diluted and disinterested in the ways in which institutional racism is persisting and is perpetuated by our own actions. So I think we have this question: how do we have this conversation about the exponential effects of anti-Black racism in all of our lives. How do we see it at the southern border of the United States with respect to Black and Caribbean migrants coming in? How do we see it in the US? How do we see it in Canada? How do we recognize that there are multiple parallel intersecting forms of exploitation and racism that persist and have persisted, and we can draw a direct line back to history. Some of these are active and intentional. Some of these are almost apologetic. There was an interesting article in the New York Times by Rachel Swarns maybe a few weeks ago about slaveholding nuns and how with compassion they were selling off families to make the budget balance. What do you call it? To make the budget balance, right? So we have to acknowledge this, but we also have to say this in and of itself, this ability to deny the humanity of this group of people in order to achieve financial stability or whatever else, right? That is a decision that's not just a one-off decision. That is a decision imbued with a series of beliefs and a series of commitments that undercut the humanity of people who look like me, right? So that's something we have to start really educating on. And people need to understand that in a deep way, so that the word reparations isn't merely about when do I get my check, because the check is actually never going to equal what's been taken, right? We're in the Black community in the US, at least, we're a couple years away from having negative wealth, which is unthinkable, right? When you think about the amount of work and that Blacks have put into building this country, right? But the way these institutions are embedded with racism contributes to both the stability and the wealth of certain spaces, but also the instability and the fragility that we see in certain states and certain communities. And we have to understand that dynamic. We have to understand what's happening in the Bahamas, where people are not being allowed to come into the US right now to evacuate, even though it's legal, right? That has something to do with the ways that we allow ourselves to view certain people, right? The current development context, the same thing. These dynamics replicate colonialism. So I will stop. I see that I'm out of time, but I do want to say, for us, this is a conversation we should be having with the International Decade on People of African Descent. And this is a conversation that hopefully the Permanent Forum on People of African Descent will keep going for a while. And we appreciate your work in this as well.
Thank you, Ms. Day. We have about 5 minutes for the panelists from both the USA and Canada to interact with Ms. Day. And then we'll open up conversation with our broader audience. Sigma, if you will help us field the questions, I would really appreciate it. So any comments or questions for Ms. Day?
Actually, Angelique is about to leave, and I think she'd like to have some questions or comments. Angelique?
Dr. Walker-Smith, would you have a comment or a question that you'd like to pose to Dominique, or anything in regards to our session?
Yes, thank you very much. I'd be very helped to know from our guest if she has specific ways in which strategies can be developed together with the partners, not only who are speaking, but with WCC as we go forward to address this systemic issue.
Should I answer?
Yes, go right ahead, Ms. Day.
You know, what I've found in our country visits is that there is a problem at the highest levels, right, where they say, oh, well, human rights are for everybody. We don't have to think about racism because we just apply everything equally. But there's also a problem in the community level where we have trouble articulating the rationales for the need to focus in this way. We have trouble articulating how institutionalized racism has become. And so, so for us, we've launched the decade. I think what I personally see the decade as is a space to really promote these conversations. The strategies that I think are most important is some people call it calling out, but really being a truth teller and acknowledging it in whatever forums we can. When I write a report, I specifically try to be as direct as possible in the ways in which we're seeing racism in the countries that we visit. I would suggest in your own ministries, in your own work, you guys have amazing audiences, and I think those conversations could be really transformational, just to really help people understand not just that racism big picture exists, but here's how it plays out in this space. Here's how it plays out in that space. And I think those micro conversations can really offer a tremendous amount of understanding and really promote critical thinking in a way that, honestly, our education system is not.
Yeah, I'd like to comment on that question too. I am learning about the power of liturgy and how it can transform, or at least conscientize people about issues. And it doesn't have to be high liturgy, but just the inclusion of, in addition to the sermon, poetry and stories and various aspects doing the worship environment that also teaches, as we all know, but keeps the issue in the forefront. I think I'm recalling when Roots came out, and some people said, well, I can't watch that, it's too painful, or I don't want to talk about that anymore, it's just too painful. But the subtlety of white supremacy and how racism impacts all of us has to call for new ways of doing liturgy and worship, so that when people are engaged, both head and heart, to think about these systemic issues that we breathe in and just are complicit with. And I'm talking about African descended congregations as well. So I'm putting that out there, and I'm interested in any response that might be that some of the panelists might have. And I'm not saying this is the only way. I'm just saying I'm coming into this new awareness of how powerful liturgy can be in conscientizing people.
I think that is so on point. I think we have to be ready. We have to get our people ready. We have to, I think everything, I mean, I don't want to talk too much because I think everything you said is really, really, really on point.
I would, we are, excuse me, I think the idea of liturgy is extremely important, especially as Christian communities. I mean, that's part of what many of us do. Some of our traditions have it more as a tradition than others, but there is something powerful in being able to use liturgy. And someone mentions here also art, poetry, music, and all these various ways. And under our idea of awakening, confronting, and transforming, trying to use a variety of ways to connect with people. But I also want to put a huge emphasis on the idea of truth telling. As we were determining how to articulate and address our issue, one of the things that we put much emphasis on was truth. And we were intentional for our purposes in the United States to not use truth and reconciliation, because I think also, or we think also, that people of faith, and particularly Christians, we want to get, as we say, go from Good Friday to Easter Sunday right away. We want Jesus to rise, but we can't sit in the pain of the crucifixion, the pain of the sin of crucifying Jesus. And as a people, we really want to feel good. And this is not going to be a feel-good thing. And there is a truth telling that cannot be skirted around and beautified and made nice. And that's a hard part for us, because we are so accustomed to that. Listening to the Canadians talking about the Canadians being nice. Well, that's part of American pieces as well. There are different groups who I think, relish and love the idea of us, even the Christian way. You know, we just have all these ways that we will not, that we'll nice it up, pretty it up, and we're not getting to that real truth. And it's a stark and hard truth, but that's what's going to be the thing that delivers us.
I would add too, I think that the power of liturgy has the opportunity to help us decolonize. Much of our liturgical practice is rooted in a culture of whiteness that needs to go, and to think about liturgy in a way that enables us to decolonize and liberate ourselves. I think it's an important part of this work.
Are there other responses in terms of Dr. Angelique Walker-Smith's question about some strategies and specific practical ways to address these issues?
In the chat room, we have Alidia who's saying art and poetry, like music, can articulate some of those complicated and nuanced understandings in a way that words fail us. Liturgy should also transform us and community. What we pray changes us. So this is from Alidia from United Church of Canada.
I think there's also this place of... No, go ahead, Seth.
Are you sure?
Yeah.
I would just add, and like are practically and addressing fellow white and white identifying folks, you know, and thinking about beautiful conferences, roundtables coming together like this, really practically what white folks need to be in the practice of doing is, as much as possible, recognizing how normative the white supremacy is that leads to xenophobia and so on, and voices that aren't mine in conversations like this, the quick instinct, and it can oftentimes be implicit bias that does it, is that these voices of people of color, women, Indigenous, more, are just coming alongside the norm. And where we really need to go practically is with the histories and stories and perspectives that are commented, I believe, and prioritized, but defaulted to at this point. Someone gave me a shirt for Christmas that says "Trust Black Women," and it's on us to practice what we preach. But I mean it just to say, like, you know what? If the world is seriously run by white men and white men in power and in the church, and we hate the headlines, then maybe we should try a different strategy. So practically, that's really hard for white folks to do, but it really just saying, I'm hearing something that is not the norm here, and I need to start a new practice and just say, what do you want to do?
So I would add to that within the Canadian context, processes of conscientization, most people think we aren't racist. I also think the church needs to look so hard at itself in terms of not just how it does worship, but how is its structures part of colonization, and not the history, but how is it continuing to do that? A lot of the people that I work with talk about being invited into the church, into church structures, and they very quickly learn that they're not invited in because of who they are and the ways they would do things, but because of the color of their skin. And so the church needs to be open to be radically turned upside down to doing things differently. And so it's not just inviting others in, but it's, it's very easy to talk about the racism in our culture, but how do we look at how racism is embedded in how we act and how we are?
We have another question from Emmanuel in Cameroon. Can we be true if we say that the problem of racism in North America today is developed from the roots of colonialism in Africa? Can we say that American Black community is in the process of completing what was planted in Africa centuries ago?
Anyone?
I mean, I think the reality is there is a common Black experience globally, right? We hear, the frustrations that I hear about and know about as an American Black woman are often echoed when I speak to Europeans, right? When I do a country visit in Europe, when we go, right? And so there is a common Black experience that is rooted in the trade and trafficking and enslaved Africans. By the way, the modern global economy also finds its roots in the trade and trafficking and enslaved Africans. So I think it's fair to talk about colonialism as the roots of a lot of racism, but it's not really just colonialism, right? Like, we don't necessarily connect colonialism to the kind of globalization that is implicit in almost all of our transactions, right? When you buy a shirt from a store in the U.S., somebody who probably hasn't been paid a lot of money in Africa and China and Asia, right, has been exploited to produce that product. And so a lot of our globalization started from a place of where can we exploit opportunity, right? That's what we say openly. But what we don't say openly is which bodies, which land, which resources can we exploit to create profit? So I think that's fair. And I think the challenge for us as Black folk is to be aware, to not be complicit, to understand that we too, especially in America, as we're a wealthy country, even if we don't all feel very wealthy, that we too are complicit and can be agents of perpetuation. I think the challenge for the world is to really recognize not just sort of the global modern economy, but the assumptions that actually fuel these ways that we make profit, these exploitations of opportunity. How much of our exploiting an opportunity, which is sort of an open thing we say in capitalism, is actually exploiting a person or a body or someone's land or someone's resources? And absolutely, that form of racism, it tracks back to colonialism, but colonialism was a much deeper and richer intervention, I think, than that word even suggests.
Mm-hmm. Emo Yango from United Church of Canada. I appreciate Dr. Day's emphasis on micro-conversations. This is perhaps necessary to consider when we're also talking about decolonization. My question is, as much as with the term decolonization has been mentioned in this webinar as advocates, how are these microspaces being utilized to get us ready, both people of faith and those outside of the community of faith?
Anyone?
I think I was going to say that some of our churches, one of the things that we've been doing under our campaign, because we're an umbrella, as the World Council of Churches is, and Bread for the World and others, there's some things that we rely on our members and partners that have resources. So some of our member communions have various types of resources that would utilize this type of technique. I know the Episcopal Church is doing some work that includes conversations. The United Church of Christ has a series around sacred conversations. So they come in different shapes and forms. So we've been accumulating these resources, and we haven't yet put them all up because we're still pulling together a catalog of those. But that's what I would say, is that there are many different groups that have them as resources. Some take training for groups to do within their communions or churches, and others you can probably read or get the information and use it.
This is Angelique. I would say one of the most important examples of this kind of micro engagement is in Louisville, Kentucky, with the Angela Project. The Angela Project goes back to one of the few persons we can name from 1619, from that period, of a woman named Angela, who was given the name, obviously, in honor of her. It's a partnership between the Cooperative Baptists, which broke away from the Southern Baptists, the National Baptist Convention of America, which is our sister Baptist convention, and the schools and the communities, mixed communities in Louisville. This project is not only having conversations, but they're actually engaging in reparatory examples of what a local community can do. That is to say, they're taking on municipal governance, and they're taking on state governance to transform laws and to build up economic enterprises and engines across racial lines to redirect resources in that community. I would invite you to go online to look at the Angela Project in Louisville, because I think it's one of the exciting local examples of what is possible. I think the local communities are very key. And even as we look at issues like mass incarceration, we see some progress in places like Florida, and we see some places in Louisiana, where I was just at, where states are taking on some of these issues in ways that matter. So at least in the U.S. context, federal, state, and local matter. And we know the civil rights movement, for example, began in Montgomery, Alabama, and other localities, and moved up, if you will, the federal chain. So those micro conversations are key, I think, to transforming the ways we even think about what models could look like at the state and federal levels.
Mm-hmm.
We have about 8 minutes left before we are at the end of our time. Are there any questions from our audience that we have overlooked, or perhaps you can restate your questions, because I know it's a rolling of the questions that you'd like to ask. I'm inviting our participating audience to raise a final question, and then we will ask Sigma to kind of tell us about next steps.
There was someone asked about whether there's a rise in racism or hateful incidents in Canada linked to political change. And I would just very quickly answer that we're seeing, the global phenomenon of an economic system where people who used to feel comfortable and safe aren't, and that is being expressed through racism, or it's giving permission to racism. And in Canada, I wouldn't say that the political change causes that, but we do have political candidates who are grasping onto that, as in different election cycles, as a way of gaining the voice of the segment. But it's, just like in the U.S., it's not caused by the political, it's a symptom.
Let me just add, I think recognizing, and I'll broaden that, recognizing that if the political system is not a cause but a symptom, I think is important. Angelique mentioned Florida, right, and where there was this massive community organizing and success to restore the voting rights of people convicted of felonies. And the first thing that happened, right, was that the legislator went into overdrive to put barriers in the way. And to all of us, that sounds very reminiscent of the Jim Crow South and these strategies done post-Civil War to make sure Black folk couldn't vote. But I think in our conversation about it, in our discourse, recognizing that that's not just a voting rights problem or an unfairness problem, but an openly racist intervention by the state. Right, when I'm talking about our micro conversations, it's also about how do we think about race, how do we talk about race in ways that really ask people to confront that the impact of their actions is actually the intent of their actions, right? These systems are doing what they're designed to do. And if they're disproportionately affecting Black people, that's actually embedded in their intent. And so, yeah, I think this idea of acknowledging the symptoms and acknowledging the racial underpinnings of that is some of the most important work we can do. And giving people language for that, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
We have one more question from Jamie Morgan from the US. She's not been able to send her question in the chat room, so she's sending it via Facebook Messenger. What will it take to encourage ecumenical conversations between racially divided churches? Would these conversations encourage more open discussion about racism in the church structure as a whole?
This is Angelique. I would say there's been a lot of conversation for many years. I think we have to really talk about how do we have modalities of action. And that's what we talked about, what I was just talking about with the Angela Project, for example. I think it gives us an example of a way forward. I think we need to talk about reparatory justice. Our sister's been talking about reparations. I think we need different conversations. I mean, the models of quote, reconciliation, and even to some extent, even restorative justice, those conversations are not unimportant, but we need some concrete ways forward of economic justice. It's a real conversation about racial justice. And what does that mean now? I just think we're beyond just conversations. We really need to have some difficult conversations about where do we go with reparatory justice? And what does that mean for people to be at a table, to be serious about that? I think there's just a lot of weariness, frankly, with charity and even what we've called justice. We need to redefine this moment. And I am grateful that we've had conversations about HR 40 on Capitol Hill, about what do we do to explore these historic crimes and these historic injuries over 350 years to people who have yet to have any real pathway into equitable life and living. Now, those are the kinds of difficult conversations I think we have to have if we're serious about the gospel and if we're serious about transformed communities going forward. And I know that's difficult, but that's part of what it means to be Christian. And I just think that's where we are, and we need to have those kinds of opportunities to do so.
And I would say, in addition to that, I think that where we started this morning in terms of thinking through how policies impact. So I think we've had a lot of conversations around racism that tends to lock it into personal behavior. And the challenge for us is that we got to move beyond. A lot of our conversation in our churches are around personal behavior. And so we don't see what Dr. Day has just said, that the consequence is the intent. And we don't see how our structures continue to perpetuate and exclude. So I think part of that shift I think you're talking about, Angelique, is also about, I think we need to understand how our policies perpetuate the racism and the exclusion. And this is not about a question of, are you racist? Am I racist? We're past that. It's embedded in the very air we breathe, and we got to get at that. And it's that structural change. And how we get at that is hard, because we tend not to want to do the hard work at looking at how our systems are just evil, put it bluntly.
Just to add, I think you're talking about institutional transitions and transformation, as well as historic root causes. We need to talk about the historic root causes from which the policies were even created, as well as the policies as well. And that's what I'm saying in terms of how we inform new conversations around reparatory justice.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I think those insights are important and critical from all aspects of this discussion. And I want to just reiterate how important this is for the discussion around Indigenous truth, justice, and reconciliation. Thank you very much.
Okay.
I want to thank all of you all for a rich and very engaging conversation from our panelists. And I also want to thank our audience for tuning in various parts around the world at various times. So I'm going to invite now Michael, if you would like to say anything, and then Sigma with next steps.
So again, just a thank you. This has been a rich, helpful conversation. I think in some ways we need more of these spaces, and we need spaces where to get at where Angelica has kind of mentioned what the concrete steps that we need to take. So thanks, and I trust this is just, as I said at the beginning of conversations, not the end.
Mm-hmm. So thank you to all the speakers as well as to the moderators for this very insightful, very rich webinar. And also thank you to all those who tuned in and joined us during this webinar. I think we were up to 65 at some point, so this is really encouraging. This webinar is, as I said at the very beginning, one regional webinar out of a series of 8. And one of the reasons we're organizing these webinars is to try to see how racism, xenophobia, Afrophobia, and discrimination in general manifest themselves in different regions. And then try to see what are the common threats, how can we find synergies across regions, how can we learn from one another. And the webinar will be recorded and made available to all our networks globally so that they can learn also from the North American experience. The next webinar will be on September 30th, and it will be focusing on English-speaking Caribbean context. I would really encourage you to attend the webinar as well. The information will be sent out soon. And because of the historic connection between North America and the Caribbean, I think there's a very a huge shared history, and I think you might be interested in participating and contributing to the conversation. I'm extremely grateful to each and every one of you for making the time to come and share some of your expertise and experience during this webinar. And the moderators, I think I speak on behalf of everyone. Thank you for making it lively and engaging, and very much appreciated as always to work with all of you. So this is the end of our webinar, and the recording will stop in a few minutes. Oh, I think technology is not on my side today. The chat room is becoming, voila. So there's a lot of thank yous coming from the chat room. This is why we hear this sound all the time. Thank you, everyone. I know it's very early in Arizona. Here is the end of the day for me. Almost 5:30. So thank you for tuning in, and let's stay in touch as we work to make sure that racial justice prevails.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.